Hey friends, it is time for another Checkly tip, and today it's going to be a little bit longer, but trust me, it's going to be worth it. You might have heard that we released our new monitoring as code workflow using the Checkly CLI, and you can now code, test, and deploy your entire monitoring infrastructure from code. And if you've used infrastructure as code before, you might now think, well, is this video about huge YAML and JSON configuration files? Let me tell you, it is not. Using the Checkly CLI, you can programmatically control your entire Checkly monitoring, and I'm talking about loops, conditions, fetching the network layer, reading and writing files. All this is possible using our new monitoring as code workflow. And I'm super excited about it, so let me show you how this works. I am in a new Checkly account over here. It's called Checkly CLI, and there's nothing in it yet. So no monitoring is taking place as of now. But as you see here with the onboarding guide, the best way to get started is by bootstrapping a new Checkly CLI project, running the command npm create Checkly CLI. I already did that, so let's have a look. At the root of this project, we will find a package JSON that defines the Checkly CLI as a dev dependencies, which means that you can go to your terminal and you can use the Checkly executable right in this directory. This Checkly command will allow you to control and define and test your entire monitoring setup, and we will come to this in just a moment. Next to the package JSON, we have a Checkly config file, which holds the entire project configuration. We have a little bit of meta information here on top, like project name, repository URL, but at the core of it, there is check default options. So if you haven't used Checkly yet, we allow you to monitor your APIs with what we call API checks from wherever on this planet. And if you're building websites and applications, you can also use our browser checks to control Headless Chrome and Playwright and make sure that your websites are working properly end to end. So inside of this checks object over here, you can define from where your checks should be running. You can give it tags, runtimes, and then you can define what files should be picked up for your monitoring in Checkly. And the way it works is that to control your Checkly monitoring, you have to define check files that are located in a defined location. So here we have the check match property that defines that all our check files are under checks and end with check.ts. I already have one of these files, so let's have a look. This is a standard Checkly file that allows you to control your monitoring setup. And on top of it, you will see that this file is importing resources from the Checkly CLI constructs. Here we have an API check, we can define alert channels, we can define check groups, and all these resources and objects can be used to interact with the Checkly cloud. And the best way to show you how this works is by setting up our monitoring. What I want to do first is I want to create a new API check. And I have a little snippet here. What we do is we create and initialize the API check object over here. We give it an ID, we give it a name, and then we configure what we want this API check to do. In this case, it is checking the API endpoint at api.checklihq.com/public stats. We're defining the HTTP method, and we tell Checkly, hey, we expect that this API endpoint should be returning the response status code to 100. So before we actually turn this API check into monitoring, what we always can do on the command line is we can test if this actually works. When we now run npx checkly test, you see that we actually tested this API endpoint from EU Central Run, which is defined in our Checkly config over here. And it's telling us, yes, this API endpoint, which we defined here, is returning with a proper 200. To break it and see if this functionality works, we can also assert a different status code. And you will now see that Checkly tells us, hey, wait a second, my friend, this API endpoint is actually returning a 200 and not a 301 as I hacked it into it here right now. So with this, we now did like a dry run of our future monitoring, and I think it's time to actually put that into the cloud. What you can do is with the Checkly CLI, you can always call the deploy command to put it into Checkly and run it on the schedule. And to see what things will be deployed when you call deploy, you can use the preview flag. And what we see here is that this call now would create a new API check with the ID public stats. So let's deploy this one. And let's confirm that this is really what we want to do. Now we can go to our Checkly web app and we can see our first monitoring resource, our first API check running here on a schedule of 10 minutes. So with the Checkly constructs, you can create all your API and browser checks right in a check.ts file, which of course is also configurable. But this API check is not alerting me yet when things go wrong. So let's also add some more resources over here. What I have here is an array which holds two strings, so the name Stefan and the name Raccoon. And to create alert channels and get notified when things go wrong, I can follow the same pattern. I have another snippet called alert channels, and we want to use the name over here. So what we're doing is we're iterating over this names array, and we keep calling and initialize these Checkly constructs. With this, we can now really detailed create monitoring and alert resources depending on what you want to do. But so far, these alert channels aren't connected to our new API check yet, so I can assign them to a new API check. I have to move some code around because right now I'm using alert channels before it is actually initialized. So when we move this one up here, we can now create new alert channels by iterating over some data, and then we're assigning them to this API check. I think this looks good to go. So let's have a look at the preview and see if this would create the resources that we expect. And indeed, it would create two new email alert channels. And I think we're good to go. So let me apply a force flag so that I don't have to confirm on my deployment. When I go back to the Checkly web app, you will find that we have now two new alert channels that were created by iterating over some data. And I already think this is pretty cool, but I would say we can do a little bit better and make our monitoring setup really dynamic and configurable. So what I want to do next is I want to fetch some information of our own Checkly APIs and start monitoring these depending on this information. When you go to our documentation at developers@checklyhq.com, you will find that we offer a bunch of API endpoints, and all these are defined in a swagger.json file. Wouldn't it be cool if we could read that file and automatically set up our monitoring depending on what is defined here? I think honestly that this is very cool. Let's do just that right now. So if you want to do some async operations like fetching things from the network, you can default an async function from your Checkly check files. And when we look at this function, what this function is already doing, it is using an getAllEndpoints function that I have in a helpers file here. See, you can just require and import, export things as ever you want. You can structure your project to your project needs. And what this file does is making an HTTP request. It's doing some filtering. The details are not really important right now, but this function will reach to the network layer. So as we're now dealing with an async function, what we can start doing is we can start iterating over the data that we get from this helper function. This function will return an array with objects that include a URL and an ID. And then you can iterate over the array, and we're following the same pattern over here. What we have is we give everything a name, which is the ID for simplicity. We define the URLs, we define the HTTP method, and we're setting some custom headers that I'm not going to show you here right now, but these are my authentication token and account ID that are currently available in my environment. And then we're also asserting that these API endpoints, all these checks that we're going to create, respond with a proper 200. We didn't look at the data yet, but let's have a look at what this would actually create. When we now run npx checkly test, you will find that there are a whole lot of new API endpoints that will be checked for a proper 200 status code. And this now means that when tomorrow we might release a new API endpoint, our monitoring will be automatically reflect these changes because we just tied together a config file that is available on the internet, and we adjust our monitoring setup depending on some data that lives elsewhere. And I think this is pretty cool. So because all our checks were passing in our test run, I think we should go ahead and we deploy these. So let's deploy these over here and let's start monitoring our own APIs with Checkly itself. So we now go here back to home. Here we have all the API checks for our own public APIs that we just created. But I think it got a little bit messy now. So the dashboard is holding a lot of API checks. As a last step, what I want to do is I want to restructure my dashboard a little bit and bring in grouping. So we're following here now, we're using the check group construct to create a new group that will be available in our Checkly dashboard. What we now can do is we can use this friend here. We can also put it on top because we want to reference it later. And now we can go into all the API checks that we just created, and we can say that we want to put them in a group, which is called public API group. Here we go. So I'm pretty certain that this works. Let's skip the test run command. Let's deploy this. And here we go. Now we can do a refresh. And what we now just finished is that we created alert channels coming from data in a synchronous manner. We created a new hard-coded API check against the public stance endpoint. But then, very, very cool, we fetched our own publicly available information about all our public API endpoints. And now whenever we deploy something or we want to create or update our monitoring resources, we can just run npx checkly deploy and make sure that our API checks living in Checkly, monitoring the APIs are always up to date, depending on some third-party data that can come from literally anywhere. And I think this is honestly very, very cool. So in summary, the Checkly CLI really allows you to code, test, and deploy whatever you need to do, whatever you need to monitor to make sure that all your applications and APIs are always up and running, and you can stop fiddling around with UIs to configure your monitoring setup. So I hope you are as excited about this as I am. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments below or join our Checkly community, which is available at checklyhq.com/Slack. And let me know how it goes. And I will talk to you very, very soon when we do the next Checkly tip.